We are most grateful in the Institute for Faith and Learning for strong institutional support to do conferences like this and the other events and activities of the Institute for Faith and Learning. And recently, Dr. Edwin Trevathan has become our new provost and executive vice president. He's here this evening and would like to extend a greeting to you. So, Dr. Trevathan, will you come? Welcome him now.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks to everyone for being here. On behalf of the university, we are so happy that you were able to join us for this very important conference and then also for this delightful dinner this evening. When we really boil down why we're here at Baylor, so much of the reason many of us are here is to really involve ourselves in the development of our faculty and our colleagues as great Christian scholars throughout the course of their careers, and then also to prepare a generation of future leaders, future Christian leaders in all fields. And as we think about that in our academic mission and our faith development, certainly at Baylor, especially, given our underranked yet number 6 in the country football team, and our commitment that we have, I think, as a university, to not only excellence in athletics, but we're really very proud that our athletes, as I hope you've heard already, have very high rates of academic achievement. And we hope and continue to have as a priority their development as well as the development of all of our students in their faith walk. So the topic of the lectures here and the exchange that you've heard, I think is really pretty central to our university. I was thinking as we were having dinner, one of the memories I have as a young man playing athletics as a high school student at a Christian high school was hearing over and over again that intersection between faith and sports and the things that we learn through sports that can teach us how to persevere in life, courage, hard work, perseverance. And the number of times I heard coaches tell me and my teammates that, quote Paul and his second letter to Timothy, that we, like Paul, needed to be able to say we had fought the good fight, we'd finished the race, we had kept the faith, and that we needed to do that in life in addition to whatever game we were getting ready to play. And at the time it could seem sort of cheesy or simple, to a high school kid. And yet those are the things that you remember as you go through life and as you face hardship, and you learn that you need to persevere and that you need to be true to your faith, especially when it's not easy. And that we can all learn those things through sport, and that we can teach and reinforce those lessons through sport is a real blessing. So I appreciate all of you being here. Look forward to our guest speaker tonight, and hope you have a wonderful evening.
Good evening. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker this evening. And I will say he has efforted long and hard to be here. He spent all day traveling yesterday. I know many of you here fought the travel and weather delays, but he spent all day, and I got the joy of meeting him at about 1 o'clock this morning. And he is here and doing well. So Randall Balmer is a prize-winning historian and scholar and an Emmy Award nominee. I'll pause to sort of let that sink in. Those don't always go together. I think that speaks to the breadth and depth and interest of his work. He holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion and serves as chair of the Department of Religion and director of the Society of Fellows at Dartmouth College. He is also an ordained Episcopal priest. Before arriving at Dartmouth, Dr. Balmer was for 27 years professor of American religious history at Columbia University. He has published more than a dozen books, including Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter, and The Making of Evangelicalism from Revivalism to Politics and Beyond. His second book, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, now in its 5th edition, was made into an award-winning 3-part documentary for PBS. Dr. Balmer is regularly asked to comment on religion and American life. He's appeared frequently on network television and on NPR. And for our younger viewers, which will make you think this is far more important, he has appeared on both The Colbert Report and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Among his notable courses is what is wildly popular and draws students from across the university, a course he titles Sports, Ethics, and Religion. So perhaps this conference would have made a nice extra credit opportunity for his students, though perhaps very frustrating to offer that to them. He's been teaching and thinking about many of the issues that have been the focus of our conversation these last couple of days and will be the conversation through tomorrow. He takes as his theme this evening, out of left field, the symbolic universe of sports in North America. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Randall Balmer?
Thank you, Jason, for that very kind introduction. I worry that as I approach the end of my career, it'll be summed up in 2 words or 2 names, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. But everything else is, as Aquinas said, dross, right? I'm delighted to be here. This is I think I count right, my 3rd visit to Baylor in Waco. And it's always a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation very much. That being said, I feel a bit fraudulent because I don't really know much about this topic. And when I saw that I was one of the, keynote speakers, I thought, whoa, what are these people expecting? But my interest in this topic actually derived from sports radio. When I was living in New York area, I would listen to sports radio in the car when I was commuting from one place to another. And I'm still overwhelmed by the passion that people have about sports. And so over the last few years, I've been trying to understand that in one way or another. Why are people so passionate about sports? And I have my own ideas about this that go beyond this paper. But this paper is an attempt for me really to understand some of the history of the 4 major sports and how they arose within North America and why we invest such meaning in these sports. As I was preparing the paper, I have to say that my recurring nightmare was that I would finish the paper and everybody in the room would say, yeah, we knew all that. This is nothing new. I hope there's something new in this, but we'll see. So here goes. And I apologize for reading this, but as I said, I really don't know much about this topic, so I can't really talk it. Competitive team sports developed in North America at a time of rapid social, economic, political, and demographic change. From the emergence of baseball in the 1840s to the invention of basketball in 1891, North America was in transition. The Industrial Revolution created vast disparities of wealth, but it also altered patterns of subsistence and male sociability. Men began working outside of the farms and socialized with fellow workers. Americans gravitated toward the cities where they encountered immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Scandinavia, and other places. Railroad lines knitted the continent together in something resembling a tapestry, making frontiers accessible. Canadians were forging their national identity at the same time the United States played out its moral crisis on the battlefields of Bull Run, Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga, exacting a fearsome toll of casualties, roughly 2% of the population. The evolution of the four major team sports in North America, baseball, hockey, football, and basketball, coincided with these social changes, and in some ways they are intimately related. The development of the telegraph and the railroad, for instance, made both intercollegiate and professional leagues possible, allowing the travel of teams from one community to another, and news about the contests to filter back to hometowns. The move from subsistence living to the factories provided at least the possibility of discretionary and leisure time, and thereby a pool of both players and spectators. The sports themselves reflected these changes. The violence of football, played by the sons, nephews, and brothers of Union Army officers at elite northeastern schools, recalled the carnage of Civil War battlefields, while baseball reflected the immigrant experience, even as it protested industrialization. The Canadian embrace of lacrosse and then hockey derived from an intentional break with English traditions in favor of a rough game that evoked the brutality and the frontier justice of Canada's vast expanses of wilderness. Basketball, an urban game, mimicked the complexities of life in the city, precisely at the moment when cities were burgeoning. These social changes also created anxieties. The 19th century cult of domesticity made white, middle-class women sovereigns of their households and the moral guardians of both their families and society. Their husbands no longer worked the land, passing their days instead at the factory or in some sedentary office job with little access to fresh air and few opportunities for exercise. Several remedies were proposed, including camping and fraternal organizations. From Britain, awash in fears that the Anglican Church had succumbed to asceticism and effeminacy, came a movement dubbed muscular Christianity. Novels by Thomas Hughes and Charles Kingsley valorized robust, athletic Christians, and the term muscular Christianity first appeared in a review of Kingsley's novel 2 years ago, published in 1857. In North America, muscular Christianity was adopted by Protestant churchmen in the decades following the Civil War, drawing on the New Testament metaphors of militarism, the full armor of God, and athleticism, running the race, finishing the course. Protestant leaders jettisoned the Puritan aversion to sports as frivolity and recommended a strenuous life marked by athletic pursuits and aggressive, even pugilistic male behavior. Therein lay an antidote to the overly feminized churches, as well as the revival of old stock Protestantism against the incursion of non-Protestant immigrants. Muscular Christianity then served both ecclesiastical and sociological ends. Many of the leaders of organized team sports were connected in some way or another with muscular Christianity, and all of the sports themselves emerged out of a specific historical and cultural context. But, like the unpredictability of the games themselves, the world of sports often confounded the intentions and the aspirations of its founders, while simultaneously functioning as an engine for social change. And now I'll go through the specific sports. The game of football arguably traces its history to the ancient Greek game called harpastum, the object of which was to carry or kick a ball over the end line of a field. English schoolboys read the greats, most of them Greeks, and football was played at several English schools in the 19th century. A particular style of play was codified by rugby school. In North America, mob games were popular at various colleges. As in centuries past, players tried to advance the ball across the goal line. Students at Princeton played a game called ball down in the 1820s, and the annual football game between freshmen and sophomores on the first Monday of the fall term at Harvard became known as Bloody Monday. Violence was rampant. So much so that in 1860, New Haven, Connecticut outlawed the game. When the faculty at Harvard banned football the same year, students protested by conducting a funeral and burying the pigskin. Football is a military game. Its premise is the conquest and defense of territory. So it is not surprising that football enjoyed its formative surge of popularity in the years following the Civil War. Although informal football games began at Princeton around 1840, America's first intercollegiate football game took place between Princeton and Rutgers on November 6, 1869, 5 years after the conclusion of the war. About 100 spectators gathered in New Brunswick, New Jersey for the game. Each team had 25 players, and the Rutgers Queensmen, wearing scarlet-covered turbans, beat Princeton 6-4. One observer celebrated the players' bleeding hands, scarred limbs, and clogged breath. Such trivialities, he added, prove no obstacle in this rugged path to glory. Princeton won the second game on its home turf a week later, but the rubber match was canceled because of objections on the part of the Princeton faculty. In 1873, 4 schools, Princeton, Yale, Rutgers, and Columbia, met in New York City to standardize the rules of football. Harvard, which had organized a football club in 1872, refused to join the gathering, preferring to follow its own course. 2 years later, Harvard engaged in the first of 2 intercollegiate contests against McGill University. Harvard won the first game, and the second ended in a tie. Walter Camp, universally recognized as the father of American football, played the game at Yale from 1876 to 1882 and coached there from 1888 to 1892. He transformed rugby's scrum to a line of scrimmage where opposing teams lined up prior to each play. More and more, football assumed a military character. Football, Camp wrote in 1896, calls out not merely the qualities which make the soldier, bravery, endurance, obedience, self-control, but equally the mental acumen which makes the successful man in any of the affairs of life, perception, discrimination, and judgment. Football owed its popularity, Camp used the word esteem, to its parallel in war. Charles D. Daly, former quarterback at Harvard and football coach at the U.S. Military Academy, agreed. Football appeals so strongly to the American public because it is a war game, he wrote. It evokes the fundamental battle spirit, and its strategy and tactics are those of war. Daly, as befit his post at Army, gloried in the martial metaphors for the game he loved. A game of football is a battle, he wrote, whose object is the destruction or the overwhelming of the enemy. Military metaphors persist. Commentators often refer to the quarterback as a field general who unleashes long bombs and bullet passes in an effort to invade enemy territory. Offensive coordinators pore over scouting reports and information gathered by surveillance during the game in order to devise a strategy, typically some combination of ground game and aerial attack, the metaphysical equivalent of earth and heaven. Linemen toil in the trenches, a reference to World War I. Many stadiums, at least before the advent of naming rights, honored war and soldiers. War Memorial Stadium in Buffalo, the Los Angeles Coliseum, Soldier Field in Chicago. From the earliest days of the game, spectators and players reveled in the game's violence. One Harvard player described the 1878 contest with Princeton the roughest ever played and declared, "The Princeton boys are the toughest we ever met." Contemporary accounts told of bloodied bodies, broken and amputated limbs, and displaced dentition. The New York Record judged that in the Princeton-Yale game of 1884, quote, more bodily harm was done than it would be possible to accomplish in a score of boxing exhibitions at Madison Square Garden. Word of football's brutality extended across the Atlantic. A Munich newspaper described the 1894 Yale-Harvard game as awful butchery, noting that 7 players, quote, were so severely injured that they had to be carried from the field in a dying condition. The paper tallied the casualties. 1 player had his back broken, another lost an eye, and a third lost a leg. Some voices called for reform. Shaler Matthews, professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School, acknowledged that football teaches virility and courage, but so does war. He urged the invention of a new game, one that would, quote, not require the services of a physician, the maintenance of a hospital, and the celebration of funerals. Reform finally came at the behest of an unlikely source. Theodore Roosevelt, a football player while at Harvard, exemplar of muscular Christianity, and President of the United States, summoned the coaches and athletic directors of the Big Three, Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, to the White House in 1905. 12 football players had died in the 1902 season, 21 in 1904, and 24 in 1905. Roosevelt was on record for advocating that colleges turn out vigorous men rather than mollycoddles, but the violence had gone too far. The president's own son had been injured on the gridiron. Roosevelt exacted promises that the rules would be revisited and penalties against unnecessary roughness enforced. Violence, however, accounts for much of the appeal of the game, then and now. By any measure, the United States is a violent society, an observation confirmed in the daily newspaper and the nightly news. The emergence of the game of football coincided with the 19th century push into the West, beneath the banner of manifest destiny, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. The military goal was annihilation of the adversary by means of violence. The earliest football games reflected that ethic. The Big Three powerhouses, Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, routinely destroyed their opponents on the gridiron. Between 1883 and 1892, for example, Yale played 112 games, losing only 3 and tying 2. 100 of those games were shutouts. In 1888, Yale outscored its opponents 698-0. Princeton beat 4 opponents, 50-0, 60-0, 115-0, and 85-0 in 1890. In 1887, Harvard outscored its opponents 660-23. Hockey. Canadian sports, William George Beers wrote in 1883, have a character of their own. They smack more of the ungoverned and ungovernable than the games of the old world, and seem to resent the impost of regulations. I cannot imagine a better description of the game of hockey. Hockey is a quintessential Canadian game, and one inextricably tied to winter. Its roots extend back to field hockey in England, but its immediate ancestor is the First Nations game known as Bagataway among the Algonquin and Tiwarathan by the Iroquois nation. Jean de Brébeuf, French Jesuit and martyr, thought that the stick used to play the game resembled a bishop's crozier or cross, so the French dubbed it lacrosse. Beers, who began playing the game at an early age, watched the matches between Indians in the Montreal area, intently studying the game. Although he found much to admire both in the game and in the skill of the players, he believed that the game needed to be rationalized. Contemporary accounts of lacrosse played by the First Nations told of no boundaries to the playing field and as many as thousands of players on either side. Beers believed that some regulations were in order if lacrosse were to flourish. In the middle of the 19th century, Montreal was just coming into its own as a city. The first YMCA opened in 1851, and regular train service was established between Toronto and Montreal in 1856, the same year that Beers, perhaps paradoxically or opportunistically, began his apprenticeship as a dentist and formed the Montreal Lacrosse Club. 4 years later, he published a brochure that laid out rules and established field size. A gathering of enthusiasts in Kingston, Ontario in 1867 formed the National Lacrosse Association. Beers, a Presbyterian, had imbibed the ideals of muscular Christianity from England, and he believed that sport was essential to the Canadian character. But he was no Anglophile. Beers pushed hard for Canadians to forsake cricket, which he regarded as sisyphine, in favor of lacrosse, which ran counter to England's bourgeois sensibilities. An ethnic essentialist, Beers touted the rough and ready character of Anglo-Saxons and puzzled that French Canadians were not, quote, as enthusiastically devoted to out-of-door sports as their Anglo brethren, though he admired their love of music. Beers believed that lacrosse was aggressive, brutal, and rugged, and those characteristics mimicked the landscape of the Canadian West. If Greece was shaped by the Olympic Games and Britain by cricket, the character of Canada would derive from lacrosse. The evolution of lacrosse into hockey in North America most likely began in Kingston, Ontario, where members of the Royal Canadian Rifles swatted a lacrosse ball on the ice, although some historians place the first game to 1839 on Chippewa Creek, which is Niagara Falls, Ontario, and even newer evidence points back to England. Halifax, Nova Scotia, and several communities in the Northwest Territories also lay claim to the nascence of ice hockey. But if the term organized is added to the formula, most narratives converge on Montreal, a city whose population had recently swelled above 100,000. There, on March 3, 1875, J.G.A. Creighton, a native of Halifax who became a journalist, engineer, attorney, and athlete, organized an early morning game for his McGill University friends at the Victoria Skating Rink, where Creighton served as judge of figure skating. The following day, the Montreal Daily Witness ran an account of the game, noting that a flat piece of board was used instead of a ball. It slid about between the players with great velocity. The paper also noted an unfortunate disagreement leading to a fight in which a bench was broken and other damage caused. Emmanuel M. Orlick, McGill's physical education director, credited the Victoria match with exciting popular interest in hockey, leading to the formation of various teams. 2 years later, Creighton became captain of the first hockey club in Canada, and the Montreal Winter Carnival popularized the game. In 1892, Frederick Arthur Stanley, the Governor General of Canada, better known as Lord Stanley, commissioned the Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup for the best amateur hockey team. The National Hockey Association was formed in 1909 by Ambrose O'Brien, owner of a silver mine in Renfrew, Ontario, with teams from Quebec and Ontario. The National Hockey League followed 2 years later. The story of hockey illustrates the transition from vernacular sport to regulated sport, which in turn can be seen as a tool of colonization and socialization. Just as George Beers routinized the rules for lacrosse, so too, in a larger sense, sports help to tame frontier passions. Schools and churches supported organized and regulated sports, which had the added benefit of reducing class tensions. Like other sports, hockey from its earliest days mitigated ethnic differences. The organizers of the National Hockey Association thought it important that French Canadians be involved, so they organized what became the Montreal Canadiens, a team initially owned by O'Brien but managed by Jacques Laviolette. Decades later, the dynastic success of the Canadians from 1965 to 1979, 10 Stanley Cups, helped to inspire the ethnic pride that fueled Quebec's quiet revolution. Hockey is an ancient game modernized, a blend of tradition and technology. The sticks were fashioned by First Nations people, and the skates became ever more technologically sophisticated. But for all of its evolution, from bagataway on open fields to armored players cruising up and down the ice, hockey retains a measure of the violence and lawlessness that characterizes the Canadian frontier. The games may take place in an enclosed and regulated rink whose rounded edges recall countless windswept skating ponds. But the game, as well as the venue, play on Canada's huge expanses of water and wilderness. Canada's extremes of climate are replicated in the chilly hockey arena, and the ever-present specter of violence in hockey is reminiscent of the fact that in a vast and uncharted frontier, players ultimately pursue their own vigilante justice. The vested authorities merely adjudicate matters after the fact. As George Beers noted, Canadian sports have a character of their own. The game of basketball also has its roots in Canada. Growing up in Benny's Corners, a community near Almonte in the northern reaches of Ontario, James Naismith, an orphan from the age of 8, remembered watching his playmates skating on Indian River. He had no skates, but he retired to his uncle's shop and crafted a pair of skates from files set into hickory wood. In warmer weather, Naismith and other boys in town played a game they called Duck on a Rock. A rock was placed atop a boulder, and the boys threw stones in an effort to knock the duck, or the rock, off of the boulder. One boy was assigned the task of defending the duck. In the fall of 1883, Naismith left Almonte to study for the ministry at McGill University in Montreal. By his own account, Naismith spent most of his time reading. One evening, 2 upperclassmen visited his room and upbraided Naismith for neglecting physical activity. He responded by integrating regular visits to the gymnasium and the athletic field into his regimen. On the way back from a visit to downtown, Naismith stopped to watch the McGill football team practice. The center had broken his nose, and the captain invited Naismith to replace him. Naismith played his first game of college football the following Saturday against Queen's University. He never missed a game for 7 years thereafter, even though many thought football, a tool of the devil, was not a proper pursuit for a student of theology. Naismith discovered, to his amusement, that a group of fellow theology students had gathered to pray for his soul. A conversation with the YMCA secretary in Montreal, D.A. Budge, persuaded Naismith that, quote, there might be other effective ways of doing good besides preaching. After completing his theological studies and a tour of YMCAs in the United States, Naismith decamped for Springfield, Massachusetts, to enroll in the School for Christian Workers, now Springfield College. There he befriended a theological student from Yale, Amos Alonzo Stagg, also a student at Springfield. Before their first football game, Stagg offered a prayer that every player would do his best and demonstrate true Christian spirit. The undersized team, which competed against Yale, Harvard, Amherst, and other collegiate powerhouses, became known as Stagg's Stubby Christians. In 1891, Luther Halsey Gulick, head of the physical education department at the school, challenged Naismith to invent an indoor game that could be played in a small space. Students were tired of gymnastics, and Gulick was looking for a game that would occupy students during the winter months between the football and the baseball seasons. Doctor, Naismith replied, we can invent a new game that will meet our needs. All that we have to do is to take the factors of our known games and recombine them, and we will have the game we are looking for. Over the ensuing fortnight, Naismith tried with no success to adapt lacrosse, rugby, and soccer to the indoor arena. Finally, at the edge of despair, Naismith reached back to his childhood game, duck on a rock. He asked the superintendent of buildings at the school for 2 boxes, about 18 inches square. Mr. Stebbins, the superintendent, instead located 2 old peach baskets, which Naismith affixed on the lower rail of the gymnasium balcony, 10 feet off the floor. The ball at hand was a soccer ball. From the inception of the game, Naismith, perhaps recalling the brutality of football, sought to stem violence on the court. The goal would be vertical, not horizontal, and players, he decided, could not run with the ball. If he can't run with the ball, we don't have to tackle, Naismith wrote, and if we don't have to tackle, the roughness will be eliminated. Rule number 5 in his 13 rules of the game read in part, no shouldering, holding, pushing, or tripping, or striking in any way the person of an opponent shall be allowed. The first infringement of this rule by any person shall count as a foul. Once the game caught on at the training school, the students became its most fervent ambassadors, fanning out as directors of YMCAs across North America and eventually the world. Graduates of the Springfield School introduced basketball far and wide. In addition, athletic clubs, settlement houses, Indian schools, military institutions, mission fields, and churches took up the game. Naismith himself, a fervent disciple of muscular Christianity, couldn't have been more pleased. Whenever I witness games in a church league, he recalled in 1941, I feel that my vision almost half a century ago of the time when Christian people would recognize the true value of athletics has become a reality. Basketball was also a game that bridged religious boundaries. The Knights of Columbus picked it up, as did the Young Men's Hebrew Association. In an era when small towns supported baseball and basketball teams, a young, aspiring impresario saw an opportunity. Born in London, Abraham M. Saperstein attended Chicago's public schools and in 1926 secured a job in the city's Wells Park Recreation Center, a job that included coaching basketball. He briefly served as booking agent for an African-American basketball team called Tommy Brooken's Globetrotters. And in 1927, the diminutive Saperstein took over an all-black team called the Savoy Big Five, named after Chicago's Savoy Ballroom. Although neither Saperstein nor his players had any connection to New York City, they took the name Harlem, New York Globetrotters and barnstormed throughout the Midwest and eventually the nation and the world. Because the Globetrotters were so good, Abe Saperstein increasingly had difficulty finding opponents, so he added trick plays and razzle-dazzle antics to the show. Still, the Globetrotters were a talented team, and their athletic success led, as in other sports, to social change. On February 19, 1948, not fully a year after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, the Globetrotters beat George Mikan and the powerhouse Minneapolis Lakers with the last-second shot in an exhibition game in Chicago. The game had the highest attendance of any professional game in the city to that point. 2 years later, the National Basketball Association drafted its first African-American player. Basketball's connections to Springfield, Chicago, and New York, as well as its general and persistent popularity in cities, suggests the symbolic meaning behind the game. Basketball is the quintessential urban game, where the object is to maneuver in tight quarters without impeding the movements of others. Any such impediment, as Naismith specified in his 13 rules, would be called a foul. Naismith had specified this among the 5 fundamental principles he considered in devising the game. Both teams are to occupy the same area, he wrote, yet there is to be no personal contact. reflect on that when we watch the NBA or college games today, but that was the idea. This challenge was especially daunting in the early years of the game. Because of the size of Gulick's physical education class, the first basketball games pitted 9 players on one team against a similar number on the other, 18 players total. And some contemporary accounts tell of games with 50 players on a team, all maneuvering within the constricted space of a gymnasium that was roughly half the size of a regulation basketball court. Basketball was intended primarily for young men who had acquired their physical development, Naismith wrote, but who were in need of exercise that would stress the skills and agile movements that were lacking in manual labor. John Calvin understood the world as a labyrinth, and the believer's task was to negotiate his way through the complexities of that world, a metaphor echoed by John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress, and embodied by life in the city. Naismith, a Presbyterian minister, was surely aware of these metaphors, and the skills that Naismith believed would be enhanced by the game of basketball might double as spiritual attributes: initiative, cooperation, self-control, accuracy, and self-sacrifice. There are, to be sure, ethereal elements to the game. A shot at the basket arcs high into the air, and the players themselves sometimes appear to defy gravity. But basketball is grounded in the urban experience, and it emerged at a time when Americans were moving to the cities in large numbers, where they encountered a bewildering mass of humanity tucked into a limited space. Anyone who has sought to navigate Times Square in the evening, Michigan Avenue at rush hour, or Fifth Avenue at noontime understands the parallel between basketball and urban life. The challenge of threading one's way through a small, defined space toward a distant goal requires a spontaneous combination of athleticism, artistry, evasiveness, and guile. Those are the qualities that define a good basketball player. The origins of baseball, as befits its mythic overtones, are lost in the mists of time. Its apologists, among whom I number myself, like to claim that it is the only game that enjoys divine sanction. The very first words of Genesis tell the story. In the big inning, God created the heavens and the earth. Baseball almost certainly has its roots in the British games of cricket, old cat, and rounders, and in the Dutch game called stoolball. But the narrative of origins in North America for many years anointed Abner Doubleday as baseball's founder. Doubleday was a Union general in the Civil War who patented the cable car railway in San Francisco. According to the story, since discredited, Doubleday invented the game on a summer morning in 1839 in Elihu Finney's cow pasture in Cooperstown, New York. This story grew out of controversy between Henry Chadwick, a sports writer who had insisted that the game originated in Britain, and Albert Goodwill Spaulding, who was eager to assert the American origins of baseball. In 1905, Spaulding, president of the National League, appointed a commission to investigate baseball's origins. Headed by Abraham G. Mills, former National League president, the Mills Commission built its entire report around a single testimony. Abner Graves, a mining engineer in Colorado, claimed that he had witnessed Doubleday devising an improvement of town ball in front of Cooper's tailor shop in Cooperstown, New York. The Mills Commission made no attempt to verify the account, and a few years after delivering his story to the world, Graves murdered his wife and spent his final years in an asylum. Indeed, there are many reasons to discount this narrative. Graves was 5 years old in 1839, and Doubleday was a student at West Point, not in Cooperstown. Doubleday, moreover, never took credit for inventing baseball or playing any role whatsoever in its development. The game receives no mention in the general's voluminous diaries. The earliest reference to baseball in North America is a 1791 town statute in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, that prohibited the playing of baseball within 80 yards of the town hall. The presenting issue, apparently, was broken windows. The city of Cleveland banned baseball in 1845, although it rescinded the ordinance the following year. Much of the credit for the game belongs to Alexander Cartwright. A bookseller in Manhattan, Cartwright organized the Knickerbocker Baseball Club in 1842 and devised rules for an adult version of town ball. 3 bases configured within a diamond with a demarcated space outside consisting of foul territories. Each batter was allocated 3 strikes, 3 chances to put the ball in play, and the defense would consist of 9 players. The new rules did away with a practice that held the possibility of injury. No longer could a defender throw the ball at a runner between bases. The first game played with these new rules took place on the Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey on July 19, 1846. The New York 9 defeated Cartwright's Knickerbockers 23-1. Over the ensuing 2 decades, the rules were refined. Baseball, as played in Massachusetts, had no base paths. Players could run anywhere around the field on their way from one base to the next. In 1857, the first baseball convention decided on 9 innings instead of 7. Bases would be 30 years apart, and the pitcher's mound would be 15 yards from home plate. The Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first professional baseball team in 1869, though they were bankrupt within a year. The National League was formed in 1876 with teams from Hartford, Chicago, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Louisville, Kentucky. In 1900, after the National League dropped 4 teams, Bancroft, Bann, Johnson organized the American League. Other innovations emerged along with the refinement of rules. The first leather glove was used in 1875, and the following year a catcher's mask was used for the first time. Previously, catchers stood well behind the batter, but even at 24 feet, the toll was significant. Broken noses, dislocated jaws, and other injuries. In 1878, Frederick Thayer, a baseball coach at Harvard, took out a patent on a catcher's mask. With the catcher now directly behind the plate, pitchers could be more creative with their deceptions. Baseball, of course, is replete with symbolism. It is the only major sport where the defense controls the ball. The object of the batter is to disrupt the defense's control of the ball, and the odds against him are overwhelming. 9 fielders are malevolently arrayed to thwart his objectives, and the batter who disrupts the defense's control of the ball only 30% of the time, 3 times out of 10, is considered a star and a likely candidate for the Hall of Fame. Because of the overwhelming odds, baseball replicated the experience of immigrants at a time when immigrants were reshaping American demographics. The lone batter toiling for success against the odds stands as a metaphor for the newcomer, and it has always been the case through successive generations that minorities have gravitated to the game and have excelled at the game. Consider the names: Jim O'Rourke, Hannes Wagner, the Flying Dutchman, Larry Doby, Felipe Alou, Fernando Valenzuela, Jose Reyes. If a player succeeds in disrupting the defense, he finds only 3 islands of safety in what is otherwise a hostile world. And the greatest triumph, of course, is to return safely to home. Baseball is about homecoming. A. Bartlett Giamatti, baseball's philosopher king, once wrote. It is a journey by theft and strength, guile and speed, out around first to the far island of second, where foes lurk in the reefs and the green sea suddenly grows deeper, where foes lurk, then to turn sharply, skimming the shallows, making for a shore that will show a friendly face, a color, a familiar language, and at third to proceed no longer by paths indirect but straight to home. pitcher's mound is a kind of cosmic mountain, elevated, closer to the gods. It is the point of creation where the game begins. Baseball is also fond of numbers, the Trinitarian valence of 3 strikes, 3 bases, and 3 outs for half an inning. The number 4 is also significant. 4 balls might be seen as an allegory to the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. And the 4 corners of the diamond correspond to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. Finally, the number 9. There are 9 positions on the field, 9 innings in a game, and 9 muses in Greek mythology. The radius of the pitcher's mound is 9 feet. Although baseball emerged during the Industrial Revolution, it stands in a paradoxical relationship with modernity. On the one hand, it embraces geometry and precision, the sphere of the ball and the shape of the pitcher's mound, the straight lines demarcating fair and foul, the 90-degree angles of the base paths, the rectangular pitcher's rubber. It also allows for variation. Early baseball players referred to the outfield as the garden, and in some fields the outfield extends to infinity, just as the frontier did in the 19th century. Even today, the outfield fences in major league ballparks are irregular. Think about Fenway Park or even Citi Field, suggesting that no one really knew what lay in that vast, expansive space that was the frontier. It was uncharted territory. Finally, baseball stands apart from its time in another important way. The icon of the Industrial Revolution was the clock, and baseball, alone among the major sports, has no clock. It harkens back to a more idyllic time. In this way, baseball was and remains countercultural. As the batter makes his way around the bases, he runs counterclockwise, not clockwise. I see great things in baseball, Walt Whitman wrote in 1846, the same year as the first game at Elysian Fields. It is our game, the American game. Baseball will take people out of doors, fill them with oxygen, give them a larger physical stoicism, tend to relieve us from being a nervous, dyspeptic set, repair those losses, and be a blessing to us. All 4 of the major sports in North America emerged from specific historical and cultural circumstances, and in a rather circumscribed geographical area, the region from Princeton, New Jersey, to Montreal, Quebec. Each sport tells a story, one embedded in its geography, its rules, its geometry, and its players. Together, these sports tell us something about the spirit of the age. Their continuing popularity tells us something about the spirit of our times as well. Thank you.
We'll invite you to come forward for questions. We have microphones on either side, so we'll get those turned on, and please come forward.
All right.
You may not know the answer to this, but what about the origins of women in some of these sports? Obviously, not all of them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I had a section I was going to leave in the paper, but I pulled it out. One of James Naismith's great surprises was that women could play the game as well. Actually, what happened was that there was a group of schoolgirls passing by the YMCA training center in Springfield, and they were watching the game being played with the boys. And the teacher came up to Naismith and said, "Why can't girls play this game?" And he said, "I see no reason why they can't play this game." And actually, the first game was played at Smith College in 1894, I believe. And it was, of course, played behind closed doors because the women were wearing bloomers, and of course that was not deemed appropriate for a mixed audience, so to speak. That's the first record of intercollegiate game or a game at a college for women. And Naismith later on in his life marveled at the good things that basketball had done for women in these games. In fact, one of the early people one of the women who played the game early on became his wife, so he had some personal connection there as well. I should also say, I want to get back to your question as well. I should also say that, and I didn't get into it here, Naismith, after being at Springfield, goes to Denver, Colorado, where he's the head of the YMCA there, and then he studies medicine. And then he eventually is hired by the University of Kansas as its basketball coach and chaplain. I mean, that's a great example of muscular Christianity, obviously. The footnote to that is that James Naismith, the inventor of the game of basketball, is the only coach in the history of the University of Kansas with a losing record as coach. The other games in terms of women, frankly, I don't know the story, to be honest. Title IX was mentioned this morning, which I think is awfully important, but that's a little bit beyond where I was going here.
Hi there. First of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed our lunch conversation this afternoon. It was lovely to visit with you.
Thanks.
You spoke about war as giving rise to football, and I was wondering what thoughts you had about the role of military involvement and how that's affected sports participation now, especially in the absence of compulsive military service in our young men.
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't thought much about it, to be honest. What's intriguing to me, when you read accounts of the Second Great Awakening, which took place, and this gets back to my hat, where I'm more comfortable, that is being a historian of religion in America. You read accounts of revivals during the Second Great Awakening. They sound like battlefields where individuals are kind of slain in the spirit, especially in the South during the Canyon Ridge revival, but other revivals in the South during the Second Great Awakening. And what that appears to be is in some ways a kind of mimicking of the Revolutionary War battlefields. There's something, I'd love to do this, I'm probably going to run out of time before I can get to this, but there's something about how wars, the effect of war on the next generation, and the next generation has to try to replicate the experience of war that so shaped the previous generation. And in the case of the Second Great Awakening, it was this subsequent generation after the Revolutionary War. I'd love to do more with that, but it's a huge project, and I'm not sure I will. But I think in the case of football with Civil War, I think that there's a very clear connection between the two. Especially because you look at the brutality of the early contests, and if you read some of the primary accounts of that, it's just devastating. See, I worried that I said, you all knew this, and
You briefly spoke to the issues of gender and race in a couple of parts of your story. I was just wondering if you could speak at all to the part that class played in the origin and continuation of these sports for the working class.
Yeah, I haven't thought much about that. I haven't done much research on that. But I mean, my sense is, I guess I see sports as a salutary. Having a salutary effect on society. And if you look at Jackie Robinson, of course, breaking the color barrier in baseball, before Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces, for example. I mean, that's an example of how sports really can bring things together. I think it's significant that the organizers of the National Hockey League right away said, we want French Canadians involved in this. That seems to me a very positive message that is being sent to the rest of society in the very first formation of the league. And I think, time and time again, who is it, my colleague at Columbia, wrote this wonderful book about the football in the South. I'm not going to remember it. And how football games have had an effect on racial relations within communities. Now, the other side of it is that many of those developments come very late and should have happened much earlier. But nevertheless, sports does kind of provide for that sort of integration and bridging of ethnic boundaries, racial boundaries within society. And I think that's one of the things that sports has to offer us. Yes.
Hi, I'm Brandon Harper. I'm a freshman at Union University. Just first of all, thank you for that really just awesome lecture. I know you said this wasn't really an area of your expertise, but you could have fooled me, and that's a very easy thing to do. So,
yeah, that's all right.
But this question might end up being a little broad. If it is, please call me on it. But backing up to earlier when you were talking about football, you were making the military comparisons and using those analogies. And when you were going through that, I was just kind of thinking, what would your thoughts be on how we can apply like the strategies, both offensive and defensive? How could we metaphorically apply that into maybe our spiritual warfare? How we approach spiritual warfare? How the two can maybe connect, since we are focusing on the connection between faith and sports?
Yeah, I go back to the New Testament, and these are metaphors that are used time and time again. Somebody mentioned, I think, is it Lisa this morning mentioned Bill McCartney and Promise Keepers. Promise Keepers is the latest major iteration of muscular Christianity, it seems to me, and it beautifully sort of drew on both of those metaphors, both the military and athletic, because McCartney, of course, was a football coach at the University of Colorado. The gatherings took place in sports stadiums with a lot of athletes and people who are familiar with that sort of thing. So I think one feeds off the other. That is to say that muscular Christianity certainly draws on both the athletic as well as the military metaphors. And I suppose you could say in turn that the idea of contestation on the athletic field can teach us something about how we battle against our own demons or battle against the demons that we see around us. I see no reason that there's not kind of a give and take, a kind of synergy in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the framework that you used, kind of how culture historically gave birth to these phenomena. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how these sports began to be tangled up with capitalism and how they became commodities in our economy.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. I can't do it in a short time. There's no way I can. But I mean, you have the professionalization of these sports, and then that's when you have the owners coming in. The owners have their economic interests that they're trying to protect, obviously, and try to make money. We had a nice conversation in one of our sessions this afternoon about how it's regrettable that sports have become so caught up with capitalism. But Christianity is involved in that as well. And about the same time, there's a new book that was mentioned this afternoon, Kevin Cruz, called, was it One Nation Under God? Is that it? One Nation Under God, which is a nice historical survey of this sort of thing, along with work by Darren Dochuk and Bethany Morton, talking about this confluence of Christianity with capitalism. And what I see in this, especially as I look at this historically, you go back to the 19th century, evangelicals in particular were very, very critical of capitalism. Charles Finney, by any measure, the most important evangelical of the 19th century, excoriated capitalism. He said that a Christian businessman was an oxymoron, right? He said that it's impossible to be a Christian and a capitalist because capitalism necessarily elevates avarice over altruism. So he had that real full-throated criticism of capitalism in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it begins to go precisely the other direction. And the Cruz book tells that story. I think he tells it more by correlation than causation, but nevertheless, it's an important narrative. And sports gets involved in that as well. So you have this sort of, dare I say, an unholy trinity of athletics, Christianity, and capitalism all together. And it's not, in many ways, a pretty picture. I think the way we see this in terms of the situation today is these owners holding communities hostage over stadiums and extorting billions and billions of dollars in many cases in order to build these huge stadiums that profit themselves for the most part. The studies have shown that despite the arguments that this is going to be an economic engine for the community, it isn't. It's quite different. So that's sort of what grieves me, I think, is the collusion between Christianity and capitalism as it relates to the world of sports. And I think that people of faith need to think about that and perhaps protest that a bit more vigorously than we have.
So on that note, your lecture spoke quite beautifully to beginnings. And I'm kind of interested in the end, maybe. As you were just commenting, I'm thinking of the Marxist notion that all that's solid, right, vanishes.
Yeah.
Do you see, as a historian in that register, what are the markings that you might see? I think there's an undercurrent in a lot of the conversations that I've heard throughout this conference about concern for the way in which sport can be abused, as you've just discussed. What are the markings, perhaps, of the end? I don't remember the Dutch game that you referenced.
Stoolball.
Right, but they don't play that anymore, for all I know. If they do, so these
not professionally, at least.
Right, these games that we take for granted, they can go away, and because you're a fan of sports radio and I grew up on it too, I'll hang up and listen to your.
Yeah, right. You didn't say first time, long time. Okay. I usually beg off such questions by saying I'm a historian, not a prognosticator, but I'll give it a shot anyway. Will the sports themselves disappear? I don't think so. I mean, they're so entrenched, I think, now in American society, although I think football has some very tough questions to answer in terms of the violence and concussions and so forth, and more parents apparently are keeping their sons out of football teams, and frankly, I would do the same if my children were younger. I'm going to probably take your question in a little bit different direction and riff a little bit on a part of the conversation that came up in the session this afternoon, which I think I really found fascinating. We're living in a time when, as you know from polling data, more and more people are describing themselves as nuns, N-O-N-E-S. More and more people are fed up in one way or another, for one reason or another, with organized religion. And we are becoming less Christian as a nation. I mean, it's indisputable in terms of polling data. And the other thing that has been troubling me for a long time, I'm a couple of decades now at least, is how do we as a society develop a moral vocabulary that doesn't draw on any one religious tradition and does no violence to other religious traditions or to people who claim no religious tradition. That is, I think, because we are such a pluralistic nation, we have been from the beginning, by the way. This pluralism is nothing new, but it's a matter of scale. It's much broader than it was. I think we're finding it more and more difficult to have those sorts of conversations. So for a while I've been saying that the biggest challenge facing us as a society in the 21st century is how we develop a moral vocabulary. That is, how do we talk about ethics in a way that, again, draws on no one particular religious tradition. And the conversation this afternoon got me thinking a little bit more. Maybe sports is that vocabulary. It is a kind of common argot that people from different ethnic backgrounds, people different racial backgrounds, people with different political views, even religious views, can talk about sports in a way that they can't talk about other things, particularly in a moment when we are so divided as a society. And maybe what is modeled on the sports field, I'm being idealistic about this, and even Pollyannish perhaps, but maybe what is modeled on the sports field in terms of sportsmanship and gamesmanship and equality and fair play can provide a model for how we deal with one another in everyday life. That's probably utopian, but it's an intriguing idea to me. We have to find a way to do that, I think, in one way or another. And maybe sports provides the vehicle for doing it. At its best, I think it does do that. Not always. And once you get capitalism in the mix, then it complicates things even more. But I'm wondering if this is something we should aspire to. Maybe sports is the way out in a society that is so deeply divided. Maybe this can provide a vocabulary for us to, at least an example for how we conduct ourselves.
Thanks for the lecture and learned a lot from it, really. What do you make of the fact that the 4 sports that you identified as sort of the quintessential North American sports are all team sports?
Well, yes, they are. I think, they just are. I mean, as opposed to what? What would be the...
Particularly, I can only speak of my experience as a Texan and as an American, but we talk a lot about individualism.
Right.
Rugged individualism.
Sure.
But the sports that grab our attention and our affections, as you've identified them, are not sports that, like tennis.
Yeah.
Golf. Golf.
Yeah.
The sports that are in track and field that are individually run. It's not that the training is not done in teams. It's not that there's not collaborative effort, but there's something different about the dynamic between those kinds of sports and lining up with 11 men versus 11 men on a football field. So I was just wondering if you think there's something interesting about that.
I think so. And again, I think that kind of comes back to what is best of America. That is that we do place ourselves as a community. We kind of tamp down a little bit on that individualism. That being said, there are moments in sports competitions when you do have the expression of the individual. Michael Jordan heading to the basket or doing the fadeaway jumper to beat the Utah Jazz. And these are moments when individuals do shine, but they do so within the context of a team. And I think that sense of community is probably one of the things that sports teaches us and probably is good for society.
Okay. So I was wondering what you would say about the rise of what I tend to think of as niche sports.
Yeah.
So you can see these, especially on like ESPN3 or something.
Yeah.
Things like ultimate frisbee, lacrosse is growing huge in the United States.
Yeah.
The X Games, surfing, even professional video game. So all these things are rising. So what do you think the proliferation of sports with wider audiences? Like these things have always been around, but now they're actually where you could actually watch these on TV.
Yeah.
So what do you think that says about the way our culture is changing?
What do you think? My initial reaction is to say that this is a function of the television culture and the 24/7 need for programming for these channels. But do you have a perspective on it?
I've thought about it. I know for me, things like frisbee, professional video gaming, things like this, these are things that I identified with, whereas baseball, football, these are things that I was specifically taught as I grew up. And you can especially see this, I think, with like the X Games, where these sort of sports are an effort of a lot of the younger generation maybe to differentiate themselves from the big four or whatever you're talking about.
Yeah. And to draw on different physical skills.
Right,
perhaps.
different physical skills.
Yeah. It's democratizing, I suppose, in some ways, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But
there could be more. There's probably more to be said about, if you thought about it long enough, some of these sports are very individualistic. For instance, the X Games are very individualistic, whereas some of them are very team-oriented, like Frisbee, even more so than a game like football, because everyone is engaged. So I guess Frisbee would be closer to basketball in that sense. So I'm not sure if you could draw a parallel between all the individual sports of what they have in common, but I think the biggest thing that they have in common is this kind of democratizing, where people are beginning to find their own niches that they identify with more. That's the main thing that I see in it.
Yeah. Good. I like that. Good answer.
I'll make this quick. Oh, I should probably back up a bit. Loud Irishman. I was actually curious. One, I think I finally realized why baseball was always a sport I loved playing in high school, even though I was scouted to play football in college. Ended up going into the seminary instead.
There's muscular Christianity for you.
Yeah. But something I'm curious about, just with my own family background, I was one of only about a dozen Catholics in my public high school, surrounded by mostly Methodists and Lutherans.
Sure.
So in your research, did you find that any common religious background with particular individuals who gravitate toward the various
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and football is the best story there. Football was a Protestant game, and the importance of Notre Dame. That Notre Dame comes along in the 1920s, and Catholics beat the Protestants at their own game. And my grad school advisor used to tell this joke. I'm terrible at telling jokes, but I'll try if you'll bear with me. The Notre Dame football player goes to confession, and he says, again, I'm awful at this, I'm sorry, but he says, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And he says, "Well, what is it, my son? What'd you do?" "Well, I took a cheap shot at the linebacker on the game last Saturday." "Oh, son, that's one mark against you. You shouldn't have done that sort of thing." And is there anything else? "Yes, bless me, Father. I did a crack block on another defender in that game." "Oh, terrible thing, another mark against you. Anything else?" "Well," he said, "I took a cheap shot at the quarterback." And I'm getting this all mixed up, you get the idea. "By the way, who'd you play?" "Southern Methodist University." "Oh, boys will be boys."